In the shadow of the public reprimand by the Emperor, the Wordbearers faced a veritable new founding, one which would forever shape the course of not only theirs, but the destiny of all mankind and the galaxy at large. It was the year 964 M30, when the 17th Legion had just returned from the humiliating censure at Khorne, and they were no longer permitted the luxury of time or ritual, as they were currently under the watchful gaze of Terra. The first target that they were sent to was catalogued only as 4716. The initial contact proved promising, as the people of this forgotten colony greeted the Legion with open arms. After millennia of isolation, they welcomed the towering grey armored Astartes as celestial saviors. But when First Captain Khorne returned to orbit, his report was damning. Irrevocably corrupt worshippers of a heathen deity. The object of this alleged heresy, a colossus referred to as only the Storm Lord, a massive totem that towered above their capital, a fusion of architecture and faith, equal parts idol and fortress. In any other era, the Wordbearers might have taken time to indoctrinate and convert. With their compliance rates heavily scrutinized by the Emperor and his wrath still fresh in their minds, there was only one answer. Within 24 hours, 190 million souls were dead, as 98% of the planet's population had been purged. Orbital bombardment turned continents to ash in a storm of fire and debris. Only the central capital survived, as they were shielded beneath a shimmering dome of energy. It was here that the seat of the government and the so-called Temple Palace still stood defiant. Then 5 full companies of Wordbearers would be sent, with Captain Sor Targlon of the 34th Company led the charge. Fighting through wave after wave of artificial intelligence-imbued war engines, legionaries broke through, suffering heavier casualties than expected. What the captain found inside would haunt him evermore. Survivors, hundreds of them, clergy, civilians, political leaders, all gathered in fear beneath the very dome that they had hoped would spare them. Targlon confronted their high priest and heard something that stunned him. They worshipped the Emperor as God. They had a copy of the Letitio Divinatus, scribed by Lorgar himself, and they wanted to join the Imperium. The captain reported this to his Primarch, believing perhaps this would lead to an end of the killings. He was wrong. Moments later, Khorne arrived at the head of a Terminatus cadre, 100 elite warriors of the Wordbearers, all assembled for a singular goal. Then came Lorgar Aurelian himself, with their first chaplain, Erebus, at his very side. The Primarch, unmoved, dismissed the survivors' beliefs as misguided and obsolete. The Letitio Divinatus was no longer sacred as he claimed. He was penning a new revelation, the Book of Lorgar. Ignorance, he said, was no excuse. Then, with a silent nod from Lorgar to Khorne, the chamber was drowned in bolt fire. As shots roared through the air, blood was spilt ubiquitously. That would be the last of 4716, as it fell, not with a scream, but with a prayer, one that would never reach Terra or the Emperor's very ears. 2 years later, in 966 M30, the so-called Pilgrimage of Lorgar took the 17th Legion to a far darker corner of the galaxy. Expeditionary Fleet 1301, in pursuit of what they called the Primordial Truth, navigated to the edge of the largest known warp storm in existence, one which would later become known as the Eye of Terror. To Lorgar, it was something far more. Making planetfall on a world later identified as Cadia, they discovered a population steeped in chaos worship. It was here, on the forgotten frontier, that Lorgar encountered Intergal, a demon prince sent by the ruinous powers. This was no chance meeting, as Intergal was a messenger and a guide, a corrupter. Through her, the veil was lifted for Lorgar, and his path, once shrouded in misplaced piety, now ran straight to the open arms of chaos. And so, the seeds of the Horus Heresy would be planted, and with them, the slow spiraling collapse of the Imperium's golden dream, and the last chance for unity in the greater galaxy died an inevitable death. In the waning centuries of the 30th millennium, the Wordbearers Legion, newly chastised from their public censure at Khorne, sought to regain favor, at least in the eyes of the Imperium. Amongst the many campaigns, their victories were cited as proof of their newfound loyalties. And within this long and storied history stood the Kronos campaign, once held up as a sterling example of righteous compliance. But now, 10,000 years later, with the lingering stain of the Horus Heresy. This so-called victory has come under heavy scrutiny. Kronos was a little-known star system filled with exactly 3 inhabited worlds, nestled near a newly stabilized warp lane between the Sol system and the Eastern Fringe. Initially, the worlds appeared mostly compliant, welcoming even. Imperial scout vessels sent ahead of the majority of the campaign reported an open willingness being displayed by the local populations as they sought to be brought into unity with Terra. Due to Kronos' high levels of technology and their mass industrial output, it was seen as an ideal waypoint for future expansion. As a small detachment of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, was immediately dispatched to cement compliance and extend the reach of Ultramar. But fate, or rather something more powerful and malicious, intervened. When en route, the Ultramarines fleet became beclaimed within the warp, delayed by several solar months, and by the time they arrived, the system had become a cinder. All 3 worlds of Kronos lay in absolute ruin. Orbiting one of these dead planets was a single, heavily damaged Imperial void ship. From within, the survivors gave a harrowing account. The scout fleet had been lured into a false parley and betrayed by the very populations that they had thought friendly, as garbled astropathic transmissions and fragmented yet chaotic messages spoke of treachery and scared humans pleading for aid. It was not the Ultramarines who responded in force, but rather the Wordbearer's Crusade fleet under the command of Chapter Master Hasbrodol. Racing to the system, his fleet reported finding signs of wide-scale psychic corruption, indicating that renegade psychers had supposedly infiltrated the population, clouding their minds and sowing psychopathy and madness into the population. Then, the chapter master would give the order, exterminatus in all but name, as wordbearers commanded orbital bombardments immediately upon arrival. The surface of the first planet was shattered from above. Then came the Astartes drop pods, purging all life that remained. This cycle would be repeated in world after world, until Kronos was burned clean of all life. According to official records, the entire operation took less than a single solar transit. At the time, the War Council hailed the destruction as a necessary purge of Xenos-based heresy, and a visible validation of the Wordbearer's penance. Therefore, no further questions were asked. But in hindsight, the silence around Kronos speaks volumes. Its strategic location, lying along warp routes directly to Terra itself, would have made it a critical loyalist staging ground during the Heresy. Instead, it had been quickly reduced to ash long before the Ultramarines could get there in any numbers, and long before the truth of Lorgar's designs came to light. Today, what is known for sure is what was once known as the power of Kronos, which has come to be an assumption. The detail was not one of righteous fire, but rather of misdirection, and the silent strategy of Lorgar, long before the heresy opened up in full. Far from Kronos, another shadow began to form. Fortrea Quintus, a feudal industrial world ruled by a reclusive monarchy which had remained outside of imperial reach for centuries. When the Great Crusade approached its systems, emissaries from the Emperor were dispatched to secure peaceful compliance. Instead, the planetary rulers executed them. At the time, the Wordbearer's Legion was already engaged in prolonged warfare against orc infestations in the Charik Nebula. Despite this, Lorgar ordered around 2,000 Astartes to the world with a clear directive: pacify the world within 3 months or never return. Upon arrival, the Wordbearers, led by Captain Julrock, encountered a dichotomy. The common people suffered in dire poverty, while their monarchs basked in opulence. The ruling army was well equipped, possessing advanced weaponry and intelligent war machines, but Julrock did not attack blindly. Instead, he turned the people against their masters. Through impassioned speeches and fiery oratory, Julrock roused the starving masses, as tens of thousands swelled to hundreds of thousands, and eventually over 1 million rallied under his banner, and he named them the Emperor's Faithful. Then they were sent to die, as the assault on the Palace of Light was an unexpected bloodbath. Waves after waves of civilians charged the fortified walls and trenches along with the bastions, armed with little more than rusted pistols and salvaged blades. The death toll amongst them was staggering, thousands per minute. Yet while the defenders were occupied at the gates, the Wordbearers struck from an unexpected front. They cut through the heart of the palace, and the captain personally captured the planetary ruler. In a public display of vengeance, he cast the monarch to the survivors of the charge. The mob immediately tore at him and ripped him to shreds. His body turned to little more than pulp and sinew, as his pain screams echoed throughout the crowd, blending into the wrath incarnate. And then, within months, Fortress Quintus was brought into compliance. The population, though scared, was thoroughly indoctrinated, and by the time the Monastrorum Adeptus arrived to begin formal indoctrination, they were shocked not only by the sheer disregard for civilian lives, but by the uncanny depths of imperial knowledge that the people displayed. Too uncanny. Years later, when the heresy erupted, Fortress Quintus revealed where its true allegiance lay. The seeds of chaos worship had been planted there early, in secret, and nurtured by Jorik's revolution. The world would then be forcibly purged by the Ultramarines Legion, as every soul on the surface had to be eradicated, and now no traces of the population remain, be they saint or sinner alike. On the 566th day of the 66th year of the 31st millennium, the Loyalist Imperium launched what is believed would be a crippling blow against a nascent traitor force led by the War Master Horus. Instead, they walked straight into the grave of their own making. This event right here is known by a name that bleeds from history like an open wound. This is the Dropsite Massacre of Isstvan V. The operation itself was supposed to be simple. 7 Space Marine legions under the supreme command of Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands were dispatched by the order of Rogel Dorn himself. Dorn, who acted with the Emperor's authority after receiving testimony from loyalist survivors of the Eisenstein about Horus's betrayal on Isstvan III, sent them in 2 separate waves. The first would be comprised of the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard, each amongst these seen as the most stalwart and unyielding of the Emperor's sons. The second wave, the Alpha Legion, the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, along with the Iron Warriors, and a massive contingent of Word Bearers would come after. But there was one critical flaw, one detail unknown to Dorn, to Manus, and to the Imperium at large. The second wave had already been lost, as the Alpha Legion, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, and the Word Bearers had all secretly pledged their fealty to the War Master and to the dark forces of the Craven Gods. Yet they maintained the illusion of loyalty until the moment it mattered most. The loyalists of the first wave landed in a location known as Urgal's Depression, an exposed basin ringed by jagged rocks, volcanic ridges, and vast crevasses. Though they took the field, it was at a great cost, as Horus had, in a rather brilliant calculated move, feigned a retreat, and it worked. Ferrus Manus, ever bold, pressed the attack further and further still, against the counsel of both Vulcan and Corvus Corax. Manus led his veterans forward into what seemed like a collapsing line of traitors, only to find himself face to face with his brother Fulgrim. He had lost his head in a rage at his brother. As they clashed, the Salamanders and the Raven Guard, seeing that this was a trap, pulled back in order to regroup and make their way for the advancing second wave. But instead of relief, they found death had descended from the skies. The legions who were supposed to reinforce them instead opened fire, and in that instant, the truth became clear. The second wave was a trap. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. Horus revealed the feint, bringing the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, sons of Horus, and the World Eaters back into the fight, slamming the jaws of the trap. The Loyalists were now surrounded, cut off from all sides, betrayed and butchered alike. The Raven Guard, cloaked in their black obsidian armor, were amongst the hardest hit, as Corax's warriors fell in droves, their flanks suddenly assaulted by Wordbearers under Lorgar's command. The Wordbearers, long considered amongst the Emperor's most devout, now bore the twisted marks of a darker allegiance. In the chaos of it all, Corax surged forward, the black wings of his armor trailing fire, lightning claws tearing through the crimson ranks of the Gal Vorbak, Lorgar's demon-possessed elite. At their head was Algril Tal, the Crimson Lord, but Corax, incensed and ruthless, tore through them as if they were regular Astartes. Lorgar watched as his most blessed of sons fell before Corax's fury. Against the pleas of his advisors, Horferon and Erebus, Lorgar abandoned caution and hurled himself into battle. The clash between brothers was swift and brutal. Corax, faster, deadlier, and infinitely more seasoned in combat, dominated the fight as he impaled Lorgar clear through his chest, leaving the Wordbearer broken and barely breathing. Raising his claw to finish it, Corax was then interrupted by a new shadow, his mirror opposite, Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, who struck like a specter, spiraling the fight out of the Raven's control. Corax, exhausted and now wounded, fired his jump pack and ascended into the smoke-choked sky. Kurz's hollow laugh laughter followed him as he vanished into the clouds. Elsewhere, the Iron Hands were being utterly annihilated. The elite Morlocks fell, and Ferrus Manus, proud, unyielding, and defiant, was then beheaded by Fulcrum, his most closest and favored of brothers. The Salamanders and the Raven Guard, now isolated and overwhelmed, could only attempt a breakout. Few succeeded, as gunships screamed into the sky and Thunderhawks, along with Stormbirds, hurled themselves as high as they could. But for every vessel that rose, many more lay broken in ash and dust, breathing in the chemicals, as they were able to allow Corax to escape, grievously wounded. But Vulcan's fate in this entire kerfuffle remained a mystery for quite some time. The Iron Hands were all but exhausted, the Salamanders and Raven Guard reduced to shadows of their former strength. When the remainder of the Iron Hands Legion arrived, they found no victory, only wreckage. Their brothers dead, their Primarch utterly eviscerated, and the Urgal depression soaked in both blood and betrayal. The Dropsite Massacre was not merely a battle lost, it was a surgical strike at the very heart of the Imperium, and it worked. Lorgar not only turned a knight to topple a king, but along with said knight, he took many a pawn. As the Horus Heresy erupted across the stars, a new terror emerged amongst the eastern fringes, a behemoth of void warfare engineering, constructed in the silent shadows of the edges of the Great Crusade. This was the Furious Abyss, a vessel forged by the twisted genius of the Dark Mechanicum on the Jovian moon of Thule. This was a warship unlike any other commission, one made particularly by the designs of the word-bearers. Cloaked in secrecy, it was purpose-built for a singular mission, to completely and utterly annihilate the realm of Ultramar. Its voyage began with blood, by attacking the Fist of Macragge, a loyalist Ultramarines vessel en route to the Vangelis spaceport. This vessel was ambushed and obliterated in short order, but before it perished, its astropath unleashed a telepathic distress cry, one so intense it was received as a psychic scream by those at Vangelis. The scream itself ignited a rapid loyalist response for Captain Kestis, the commander of the Ultramarines fleet, wasted absolutely no time at Corrales, the main Vigilus hub. He assembled 7 of the strongest, mightiest vessels of the Ultramarines, the Wrathful, and amongst these was the Wrathful, which he claimed as his flagship, accompanied by Fearless, Ferox, Ferocious, Fireblade, and oddly enough, breaking the F naming convention, the Waning Moon of the Thousand Suns Legion. Captain Vorlocks and his ship, the Boundless, soon joined them. What followed was a pursuit through the void that culminated in a pitch fleet action against the Furious Abyss. The cost upon the Ultramarines was staggering, as only the Wrathful and Fireblade remained, as the rest of the Loyalist forces were systematically destroyed. Then, in a desperate maneuver, the Furious Abyss transitioned into the warp. The Loyalists gave chase, but this was a trap, as a psionic missile detonated mid-transit, disrupting their Geller fields and breaking the defenses from the warp that the Fireblade had, exposing it to the raw, ravenous entities and power of the Imperium. The vessel itself would be torn apart, its occupant screaming into oblivion. The surviving Furious Abyss emerged near its target of Ultramar, its final destination that of Calth. From the command throne aboard his newly christened ship, Infidus Imperator, or the False Emperor, Cor Ferron, first captain of the Word-Bearers and former master of faith, initiated a planetary genocide. His hatred of the Ultramarines kindled long ago in the burning field of Kur, as Monarchia was destroyed, and it found its ultimate expression in this very act of devastation. Calth's sister worlds were the first to die, ruptured with geonuclear barrages. The star of the system was then poisoned, infused with volatile materials that accelerated its decay and made its radiation output lethal. Within a century, Calth's surface would become uninhabitable, forcing its populace to retreat into vast underground cities carved deep beneath the planet's crust. The invasion itself was grotesque, as Word-Bearers deployed millions of mortal cultists as expendable barricades and loosened demons from from the depths of the warp in numbers not seen since the Unification Wars. The Ultramarines, though caught off guard, held their ground, as many defenders were Calf-born, and their resolve was unshakable. Guilliman coordinated a complex defense from orbit, directing isolated pockets of resistance into unified coordinated counteroffensives. Captain Venitas played a pivotal role here, leading a daring breakout that secured key defense laser silo, bolstering the besieged Ultramarines fleet from the planet's very surface. Though greatly outnumbered and vastly diminished, Guilliman's loyalists delayed the word-bearers long enough for the rest of the 13th Legion to arrive. In the ensuing counterattack, the Ultramarines would break Khorne's siege. Before retreating, the word-bearers turned Calf orbital weapons against the very Viridian sun itself, stripping its photosphere and sealing the world's fate. Calf, once a verdant garden world of learning and loyalty, was now a scorched tomb. But the true goal was far more sinister than this. Using the battle as a ritual of focus, the word-bearers summoned up the legendary Ruin Storm, a warp anomaly of terrifying scale. The storm itself severed Ultramar from the Imperium, isolating Guilliman's forces and preventing reinforcements from aiding the Emperor during the Horus Heresy's final push to Terra. As Calth burned, loyalists found themselves trapped underground, engaged in protracted sieges beneath the planet's very surface. Even as the word-bearers retreated, many of their numbers were stranded, continuing the very slaughter in Calth's endless catacomb. Khorne himself was finally forced to flee, as reinforcements from McCragg had broken the siege and threatened to take him and his flagship down, and so he would escape into the depth of the Maelstrom, a warp rift nearly as dangerous as the Eye of Terror. Guilliman, for his part, had never set foot on Calth during the battle, deliberately drawn away by word-bearers sabotaging him elsewhere. When he returned, it was too late to prevent the atrocity in its totality, but not too late to seek vengeance and retribution. Now, with a scarred empire beneath him, he and his legion were burning for retribution as Guilliman vowed to hunt down his traitorous brother Lorgar and bring a reckoning unlike any he had seen beforehand to the word-bearers for their crimes, and said reckoning would be so great that it would be etched into the very stars. What appeared to be a punitive strike on Calth, just one more blow in a broader campaign of vengeance, was in truth something far more calculated. Unknown to even his most zealous agents, Erebus and Khorne, the Primarch of the 17th Legion, had given the order for Calth with a purpose hidden even from them. Beneath the tides of war, a quiet purge was taking place. Lorgar Aurelian, once humbled before the Emperor, made to kneel in shame, had not forgotten that bitter lesson, nor had he forgotten the pride of his legion, nor its weakness. After humiliation on Khorne, tens of thousands of word-bearers had come to loathe the Ultramarines. Their hatred was fanatical, but fanatics, Lorgar understood, were not always useful. They then summoned a gathering, not one of banners or public rites, but of whispers. While the fleet drifted towards Calth, Lorgar called forth Algril Tal, the first Galvorback, and another officer whose name would one day echo amongst the Vakral Jarl. He sought their counsel, not on strategy or glory, but judgment. The word-bearers had purged Terran loyalists before, quietly, but never had they embraced a grand genocidal spectacle like that of Isstvan III, like that of the Isstvan III atrocity, orchestrated by Angron and others. Still, the need for purification returned once more. Lorgar questioned not the loyalty of his legion to him or to chaos, but their clarity. Entire companies, even chapter structures, had become lost in a burning directionless rage. Their hatred outpaced their reason, and they were no longer assets to be used in any effective means. They were instead liabilities. And so it was decided. A sacred mission was declared, an assault on Calth, a theater promised to sate the legion's thirst for vengeance. Erebus and Khorne would lead this host, unaware they were spearheading the damned. These warriors were never meant to return or to survive. The word-bearers did not purge at Isstvan III, but rather they purged at Calth. But while the cull was effective, the cost was steep. The Galvorback, along with mortal cultists and countless legionaries, were abandoned beneath the surface of an irradiated wasteland, condemned to a meaningless subterranean war, and they would never be reinforced. They would never return to the Legion. Those who had fasted, scarred themselves, and prayed for the gift of the divine blood were now lost, as unrecoverable relics of a failed gambit. Though Rabuc Guilliman had survived, and half of his once mighty fleet had been destroyed by the Ultramarines' counterattack, Erebus had achieved the bare minimum, creating the Ruin Storm, and the Unwanted had also been removed. Lorgar, displeased but not surprised, accepted this outcome, as the culling was now complete. Now the Shadow Crusade could begin proper. Launched in the opening years of the Horus Heresy, the Shadow Crusade was Lorgar's vengeance written in fire and brimstone. The Wordbearers, alongside the savage World Eaters, descended upon the 500 worlds of Ultramar. As planets burned and cities were utterly consumed, the warp itself bled into reality, and for the first time since the Age of Strife, the ruinous powers did not merely influence war, they transformed it. The campaign, stretching from 007 to 009 M31, was not simply retaliation, but it was strategic misdirection. The goal was to draw out the Loyalist forces away from the War Master's path to Terra. Guilliman's empire would be left in ruins, and the very foundations of reality would begin to buckle under the weight of chaos unleashed. And on Nuceria, Angron's homeworld, the madness deepened further still, as this was not simply a war. It was not simply retribution shaped into a ritual. It was a shadow crusade, led by those who had already shed their own blood. In the dying light of a sundered imperium, two brothers, Lorgar Aurelian and Angron, stood side by side upon the blood-soaked soil of Nuceria. This alliance was no simple military accord. It was a pact forged in divine ambition and sustained by mutual ruin. Their campaign was known by those who survived it as the Shadow Crusade, and it would become one of the most brutal offensives of the Horus Heresy. As the Wordbearers struck Calth with brutal tactical precision, Lorgar initiated a second wave of devastation alongside the ever-volatile Angron and his World Eaters. Lorgar dove deep into the heart of Ultramar, and together they ravaged 26 worlds in swift succession. At least partly due to this not being for conquest of territory, but rather a ritual. Each slaughter paved the way to the creation of the vast and violent warp anomaly known as the Ruin Storm, a living tempest of raw immaterium made manifest, and it would sever communication and transportation across the stars, isolating Guilliman and his realm from Terra. It was a masterstroke in the unfolding heresy, and its consequences would echo throughout reality for centuries to come. Yet behind the tactical objectives, Lorgar observed something more personal, something critical. Angron was rapidly deteriorating. The butcher's nails, those crude and savage implants once officially hammered into his brain by the Nucerian slavers, were not merely driving his rage, but also consuming his life, burning away what little he had left at ever-increasing paces, as the implants were inherently incompatible with the Primarch's biology. His body fought to heal, even as the nails continuously burrowed deeper and deeper still into his mind. As his rage grew, so did his time diminish. In a moment of equal parts strategy and fraternal care, Lorgar offered Angron a path. Return to Nuceria. Let the tormentors who had once enslaved him provide the answers about the very tools of his suffering. Lorgar promises they would learn all they could and then reduce the world to glass and ash. Whether Angron fought him, hated him, or even trusted him, records tell us not. What they do tell us is it mattered little to Lorgar. The first apostle would see his brother crowned by the dark gods, willingly or otherwise, but vengeance rarely goes unchallenged. As Nuceria burned under the wrath of its most infamous of sons, a fleet arrived. The 13th Legion, now led by Guilliman himself, emerged at the very edge of the system, aboard Courage above all. This was a retribution force, 41 vessels strong, but unfortunately it was not a proper fleet. It was a coalition made of the surviving fragments of a fleet forged together by necessity and fury, and their goal was not conquest, not vengeance, but rather justice. Guilliman's ship swept into the system, exchanging brutal broadsides with the Wordbearers and the World Eaters, while the larger cruisers ran interference, striking at the Fidelitas Lex and attempting to seize the legendary conqueror of the World Eaters. The smaller vessels raced to Nuceria's atmosphere. Planetfall became a desperate gamble, as drop pods hemorrhaged from low orbit, and gunships roared through fire and steel. The Ultramarines weren't simply fighting for a tactical advantage. They wanted retribution, and retribution they would have for Calth, for Ultramar, and for the Imperium that Lorgar had betrayed. But the Conqueror did not yield. Its commander, Lotara Serene, one of the greatest human commanders in the Imperium's history, refused to play a passive hand. She instead directed brutally her vessels, swatting down vast vessels mid-assault. Yet even her resolve had limits, as the Ultramarines, through sheer force and determination, broke through, and they made landfall. And so, here on the cursed world of Nuceria, beneath a sky scarred by the ruined storm's birth, a new reckoning was beginning, one that would see a brother clash against brother. Vengeance consume entire populations, and the ancient soil of Nuceria cracked open once again, but this time under the weight of godhood, fury, and fire. By the time the Fidelitas Lex made its final descent, it was already shattered and wrecked from its former majesty. Once a monument to the 17th Legion's faith and fury, now it drifted wounded in orbit, its armor cracked, its shielding arrays long collapsed, and its proud cathedrals turned into broken spires, peeled away under the Ultramarines' relentless, remorseless fire. The 13th Legion had not chosen brute force, but precision and attrition, and that had been the weakness of the Fidelitas Lex. Time and time again, their vessels made strafing runs, hammering broadsides into the Lex's flank, as they would bleed the larger vessel dry, as not a single killing blow would be struck, but rather it would be death by 1,000 cuts, as the persistent strikes would wear it down turret by turret, cannon by cannon, blast by blast. Reboot Guilliman, orchestrating the assault from the courage above all, had made his decision. The Lex would die first, and its death would be a slow one. The Conqueror, on the other hand, would be boarded and dismantled from within. Even as the flames consumed her hull, the Lex did not fall quietly. She fought with a fury befitting its grim and dark legacy, lashing out at the swarm of smaller and more agile, nimble craft, crawling across her like carrion birds. Her remaining macro cannons thundered defiantly into the void as darkness closed around her. Salvation pods, mechanicum landers, and evacuation barges poured out from her broken underbelly as the civilian crew, adepts, and mortal auxiliaries fled into the darkness. Below them, the word-bearers had already landed on the surface of Nuceria, and they made ready for war. But even in her final moments, the Lex refused to surrender, as fire blossomed from her wounds, and she trembled as she tumbled into the atmosphere, trailing smoke and dragging her burning weight across the world towards its easternmost ocean. The stern was the first to drop, its engines ablaze, leading the way into the planet's dark embrace. Meanwhile, the Conqueror faced its own reckoning. The Ultramarines' battle barge, Arsman, came alongside, launching boarding torpedoes and assault crafts. As the World Eaters fought to repel the invaders, Guilliman and his smaller vessel broke through the distracted defenses. Drop pods screamed down towards the surface, carrying squads of the 13th Legionaries veterans from Calth, clad in scorched armor, eyes sharp with a righteous fury. They landed in formation, bolters raised, movements crisp and almost mechanically furious. These were not ceremonial warriors remembered from the earlier days of the Great Crusade. No, they were survivors hardened by atrocity and toughened by betrayal. But the World Eaters were already waiting for them. The first clashes were brutal. The 12th Legion, driven by the butcher's nails, the cruel cortical implants that gnawed at the very meat of their mind, descended upon the Ultramarines in roaring pack, as they struck with axe and chainblade alike, heedless of defense, slaves to the very bloody rhythm of war. It was only after this that the Ultramarines were forced to build footholds, which the World Leaders would continue to swarm and shatter. The madness of the nails made them fearless, and the Ultramarines paid for every inch with a pound of flesh and oceans of blood. Yet the word-bearers were no less committed. Advancing in a solemn pace, they chanted verses from the Book of Lorgar, lifting bone-white icons and bloodied relics. Their hatred ran colder than the 12th rage, but no less deep. They answered the 13th's fire with drowning hymns and methodical slaughter. The Ultramarines responded in kind. No quarter was asked, none would be given. These were not warriors meeting for the first time. They were grandsons of the same patriarch, now enemies in a war that had no bottom. And then, amidst the chaos, it happened. One moment history would never forget. Daemon Primarch of the 13th Legion, architect of reason and order, found his quarry at last. In the smoke of the ruined Nuceria, he came face to face with his hated brother Lorgar, wielding the Crozius with both familiarity and contempt. Daemon himself bore two weapons, but Lorgar's Crozius Maul gave him greater reach and power. There was no dramatic proclamation, no speeches of vengeance or forgiveness. The brothers met once, power fists against war maul, their energy fields colliding in a flare of searing light that forced both to step back. Around them, their sons died by the hundreds, but neither Primarch spared a single glance. Lorgar looked to Daemon and simply shook his head. Whether it was of guilt, regret, or inevitability remains. And so it came to pass. Brother turned upon brother, and loyalty gave way to vengeance. What follows is not legend, but rather record. The final days upon Nuceria were soaked in blood and bitter truth. The Space Marines who bore witness would struggle to recount what they had seen, not from fear, but from disbelief. For upon the ashen soil, 3 of the Emperor's sons, godlike in stature and purpose, warred with a fury that defied comprehension. Daemon, Lord of Ultramar, sought justice, retribution, and vindication for atrocities committed by the 17th Legion across the 500 worlds of Ultramar. In the shadow of a dying sky, he met Lorgar Aurelian, not as a brother, but as judge, jury, and executioner. The clash of their titanic forms was nearly imperceivable to mortal eyes, a blur of motion beyond comprehension, as Daemon struck first, his thunderous fist shattering Lorgar's sternum. Yet the word-bearer responded in kind, casting his brother back with a flicker of unstable telekinesis, barely enough to stagger him. However, the blow that followed came not from force of will, but rather a relic, a Crozius Arcanum. In its energized field, trailing arcs of lightning collided with Daemon's skull and bone, splitting it at least partly open as blood flowed, and still they fought. But the duel was not destined to remain one of theirs alone. From the ranks of the beleaguered Ultramarines surged a figure, armor fractured and gory, blades singing with ruin. Angron, the Red Angel, emerged from the slaughter. Hours had passed in the crucible of the front lines, and he wore his victories like a shroud. His twin chain blades chewed through ceramite and flesh alike. Across his chest hung a bandolier of skulls, tokens from the dead Deshika Ridge. These were not trophies, but rather relics, bone fragments of a brother, a sister, all those gladiators he had once called kin in the blood pits of Nuceria. Even now, driven by the madness of the butcher's nails, Angron let their lifeless eyes bear witness as he brought vengeance to the world that had betrayed them. His target now was Daemon. Where reason might have faltered, hatred gave him fury. The Lord of the 12th Legion hurled himself into the fray, replacing Lorgar in the duel, as his blows came like a storm, unleashing an unrelenting monstrous flurry of strike. Daemon, master of war and strategy, found himself forced into a desperate defensive. Why had Angron come at this point? The roots lie buried in Nuceria itself. The battlefield, before the final battle, the Primarch had returned to the site of his greatest failure, the ridge where his rebellion had died, and he had paid his respect to the remains of those who had once stood with him. But when he ventured to the city of Deshka, seeking answers, he found only lies. He was told that he had fled, that his rebellion was cowardice, and that he had not been brave enough, and that the brave had died alone. It was more than Angron could bear. Consumed by rage, he ordered the extermination of Deshka. The entire planet, every high rider, every lie, all of them would die. At the apex of this campaign, Lorgar's pursuit drew Daemon to Nuceria itself. And when Daemon at last found his brother, the confrontation spiraled beyond expectations. Daemon struck true again, his fist barely clipping Angron's chest, shattering one of the skulls affixed to the chain across his torso. The relic, the memory, cracked and fell to the ground. Daemon stepped forward, his boot crushing the splintered bone into powder. That was the moment everything changed. Angron's scream split the very firmament of the world, and it was a howl, not of rage alone, but a mourning too profound for language. Lorgar heard it, and more than that, he felt it. The warp boiled behind the veil. Without pause, Lorgar began to chant, an utterance alien to all creation, not spoken, but rather shaped. His words laced in harmony with Angron's bellow, as the air itself began fracturing underneath the weight of the ritual. Daemon did not yet understand, but he soon would. The sky of Nuceria would be split asunder as crimson rain fell and manifested from the ruin storm. And with it came the whispers of the Neverborn, demon entities of old nightmares, summoned not by accident but rather by Lorgar's secret design. Lorgar's hand did not offer salvation. However, he forced ascension upon Angron, as he forcefully locked Angron in place. Synapses burning, nerves ignited, blood turned first to silver, then to fire, and the transformation began, agonizing, absolute, and oh so terrifying. Angron's cries no longer belonged to a man. His body, broken and abused, tore itself apart and rebuilt itself into something more, something perfect in its hatred. Thus did the red angel fall and rise. This was a moment of apotheosis, an unwilling one at that, and so the skies of Nuceria would never forget. This was the birth of the Demon Prince of Khorne, Angron. As a storm of the Shadow Crusade tore across Ultramar, a final desperate act had unfolded, one which largely lays forgotten, yet it is critical in understanding the fate of the 12th Legion and the cost of brotherhood perverted. It began with a flicker in the warp, subtle, yet sharp enough to be felt by those attuned to it. Amongst the world leaders, only a small handful remained uncorrupted by the butcher's nails. 19 librarians, psychers whose minds had survived without the cruel implants that would have driven their gifts into madness. These 19 had long since stood apart from within their legion, as ghosts of the old warhounds, remnants of a time when Angron's sons had not yet become the embodiment of slaughter. Now sensing the psychic gestalt and convulsions of Lorgar's sorcery, they acted. In a moment of impossible will and unity, the librarians joined their minds and formed what would be called the Communion, a gestalt consciousness forged from the 19 psychic souls, and they struck not at Lorgar's body but at his very soul, wrenching it from its flesh, mid-incantation, drawing him into the very immaterium. Within the swirling madness of the warp, two entities collided: Lorgar Aurelian, the Urzich, Primarch, Prophet, Sorcerer, and the Communion, the last spark of the Warhounds. Each believed themselves to be the salvation of Angron. Each thought the other diluted. Their battle was not of fist, but rather of will, belief, and raw psychic might. But Lorgar was no stranger to the warp. He moved within it as a creature born in its current, and the Communion faltered. Then it broke. Back in the physical realm, Angron had completed his apotheosis. Where once stood a Primarch in agony, now rose a Demon Prince, a war god made manifest, and his first target of his fury were the Psychers, those whose mere presence had caused the nails to shriek within his skull for decades. Angron descended upon the Communion's remains like a storm of axes and fury. Each of the 19 librarians met a different death. Some were torn apart midway through, others simply ceased to exist, snuffed out like candles in a hurricane, and when the last one fell, the librarians of the world leaders died with him. No more psychic voices would be raised amongst the 12. The legacy, the flaw, had been purged, burned away in blood and fire, and so Khorne was pleased. There would be no more hesitation, no more inner struggle, only rage and slaughter. Lorgar, bloodied but victorious, believed that he had done what none else could. He had freed his brother, not from weakness, but from suffering, not from doubt, but from pain. In his eyes, it had been a mercy, but to Angron, one master had been traded for another. He had been denied the freedom of death and been returned to slavery once again. But this was a slavery eternal. On Nuceria, the world leaders finished what they had begun. No human life remained. Guilliman, wounded and reeling, escaped the madness, though what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his days. The Shadow Crusade, satisfied with its devastation in this sector, turned its gaze from Ultramar to the next target, Terra. But Lorgar's preparations had begun earlier. In the year 007 M31, before the flames of Calth were ever ignited, the Furious Abyss was born, commissioned in secret and forged in Heresy. Following the conquests of the Artrian technocracy and the acquisitions of their lost standard template constructs, Lorgar had approached Calbor Hal, Fabricator General of Mars, and convert to the War Master. There a pact was struck. Forged from the fires of the Dark Mechanicum came the first of three behemoths. The Furious Abyss, a vessel of impossible scale and blasphemous design, was built to deliver retribution upon the Ultramarines. Its mission, annihilation. Calth was to burn and Macragge was to fall. But the Imperium was not blind. Before the Abyss could unleash its wrath, a small strike force of loyalist space marines uncovered the vessel's existence, and they boarded it in secret. Fighting through its corrupted hulls, scales, and in the depths of its plasma generatorium, they struck a blow that would echo throughout the stars. The generatorium was sabotaged, creating a chain reaction that ignited, and so the furious abyss died before it could kill anyone, meaning the word-bearers had lost their spearhead, along with the Fidelitas, but this was just the beginning. As history shows, sometimes it's not the armies that decide the fate of the empire. Sometimes it's 19 voices raised in unity, or a single strike team armed with truth, determination, and sacrifice. Yet even such heroism may not be enough when even the chaos gods are forcing their hand on the scales.